All right, I hope everybody's okay with me recording the September WEAll talk. Welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us here today. We are really excited to have another exciting WEAll talk ahead of us. And this time we're really fortunate to have Milena Büchs to be our speaker. Milena is gonna be discussing with all of us about how do universal basic income and universal basic services compare from an eco-social policy perspective. And just 1 second, as there are people trying to join us, and I just want to make sure that they're going to have the opportunity to listen to all of us. As they're entering and joining us, I just want to welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I was just going to introduce Milena. She is an associate professor in sustainability, economics, and low carbon transitions at the School of Earth and Environment at the University of Leeds. With a background in sociology and political science, her current research focuses on climate change and inequality, fair climate policies, and sustainable welfare. Milena has led and collaborated on several major interdisciplinary UK research and innovation grants, including on the current UK Centre for Research into Energy Demand Solutions. Prior to joining the Leeds University, Milena was lecturing at the University of Southampton in sociology and social policy. So with this introduction, I just want to let everyone know that WEAll Talks are participatory events. So we're going to have the pleasure to listen to Milena and everything that she's going to be sharing to all of us today. And then afterwards, we're going to have time for discussions, for questions, for exchange of ideas and suggestions. So enjoy this wonderful time that Milena is offering us. And if you want to leave any questions while she is presenting, please use the chat and I'll make sure that that question or comment reaches her after her introduction. So thank you, everyone. Milena, all yours.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Anna, for this lovely introduction. And yeah, welcome to all of you. Many thanks for joining. It's very exciting for me to talk to you today because what I will be presenting is based on a paper that I've recently written and published, and actually you're the first ones I'm sort of properly presenting it to. So I'm very excited to hear what you think, and I'm looking forward to the discussion that we will have. So can you hear me all right? Yeah, good. So I'm going to share my screen because I have prepared some slides. Oops, and I'm on the wrong slide. Okay, so yeah, so I will say a few words sort of to introduce the talk, and then as Anna said, it's really meant to be very participatory, so I have prepared a little question for you at the beginning, and then hopefully we can have lots of questions at the end to discuss what we think. So I'm talking about obviously universal basic income and universal basic services. And with this question in mind, how can they actually, in a way, actually contribute to a well-being economy? This is probably how I should have phrased the title. The background to all of this is probably clear. We have a very urgent ecological crisis. Climate change impacts are really increasing day by day. There's growing inequality across the whole world and a range of other really pressing social issues that need to be addressed. And so this really calls, to my mind, for a new social ecological policy model that does not prioritize economic growth and instead sort of really prioritizes the ecological outcomes and social and fairness outcomes. Basically, this is what a well-being economy is. And so universal basic income and universal basic services have both been promoted as approaches that could support such an economy. I say here sustainable welfare. This is, I think, nearly equivalent. I will, however, give you a quick definition of sustainable welfare in a moment. So they have both been promoted, both been said to be able to support such a well-being economy, but there are quite a few controversies around how these two compare and whether or not they are actually in conflict with each other. So again, I will explain this in more detail in a moment. At the bottom of the screen, you see the link to the paper, and I can also obviously post it in the chat function after the talk. So to get then to our first question, I'm very curious to hear from you whether UBI and UBS have been discussed in the country that you currently live in, and which one has become more popular. So yeah, if you want to say something in response to this question, you can just raise your hand, or of course also just unmute yourself and say something, or you could put something into the chat as well, which I think if I have my slides on, I can't actually see the chat. So
I was going to tell you, Milena, that maybe it's best to stop sharing so we can see if anyone is raising their hands.
Let's do that. Yeah.
Jeremy, I can see, and Rosanna, if you want to open your mics and you want to share a little bit of. Garrett, I can see that you raise your hand. If you want to unmute yourself, you're muted.
Thanks. I'm from the Netherlands. And there is a large community promoting the universal basic income, but I have not seen any discussion on universal basic services.
That's interesting. Thank you.
So Milena, I can see that there are a few comments. Anne, would you like to share?
Yeah. Hello, everyone.
Hello.
Yes, I'm in Ireland. There's a good movement for basic income. Many people advocating it here, and it's got a bit of traction in particular since the pandemic started. The people in the trades unions in general tend to promote basic universal basic services more than basic income. However, there's a growing conversation around the fact that they shouldn't be seen in opposition to each other, but that they actually complement each other, and that having a basic income allows people the kind of flexibility and independence of decision making that they don't have if they simply have basic services.
Very interesting. Thank you.
And Milena, I don't know if you have seen it, but Jeremy has shared that in California, UBI is more popular than UBS.
Yeah.
So
yeah, great. Oh yeah, and Anne, you have also put something into the chat. Yeah, for Ireland. Yes. Excellent. Yeah. Brilliant. This is really interesting to me because, yeah, I had this sort of slight suspicion that maybe UBS still remains to be a bit less known than UBI, and that there's maybe still less discussion about it. But it's very interesting to hear from you, Anne, that actually they are both discussed, and that the trade unions are more behind the universal basic services. And yes, I can absolutely see in a way why that is. Yeah, and yes, and Roger, you said something about the UK here, and that at the moment, at least, UBS is much more popular. Yeah, yes, that is interesting, isn't it? Sort of the country differences there. And Johanna, you also said something about Finland, where the welfare state is quite universal in terms of services, and basic income has been debated for decades, but not so much recently. Okay. That is really interesting. So there seem to be quite different country specific discussions going on. Okay, well, how about I go into my talk and talk you through, what I try to argue in this in the paper, and where I do, by the way, argue that the two are compatible. So I do want to make that argument, absolutely. And I hope I'm coming to a sort of reasoned argument in relation to this that basically explains why they are actually compatible, because they both have specific strengths and weaknesses that can complement each other. And I also try to argue in the paper that it really depends a lot on the policy context and how the economy is organized, in the country that they're implemented in, and that really shapes, I think, the outcomes of UBI and UBS. So, just in case, because some people also said UBS hasn't yet been discussed so much, I wanted to give you a very brief definition and overview of what universal basic income and universal basic services are. So universal basic income is usually understood as an equal per capita, unconditional income that is paid to every resident by the state. So unconditional usually means there's no means testing, there's no needs testing, there are no conditions in terms of whether you have to, for example, be actively looking for a job or taking part in some kind of training program or whatever. So in that sense, unconditional. Everyone gets it. And yes, as I think some of you have already said, UBI has certainly been already discussed for decades in many countries, and it actually has a really long history, because the very first initial ideas for UBI, they really go back to at least sort of the 16th century. More's Utopia is sometimes mentioned here, and Thomas Paine's ideas as well about a more equal way to pay people an income. So what I say in the paper is that UBI in some way focuses on the consumption side of the economy. And that is because UBI is, of course, a cash income, so that people then can spend on goods and services that are available for purchase on the market. So it really relies on these goods and services to be actually available on the market, right? It does not actually interfere with how these goods and services are being produced. So in that sense, UBI focuses on the consumption side of the economy. So universal basic services are different in the sense that they directly basically impact on how these goods and services are being provided. And so the idea is that basic services that aim to satisfy basic needs, are being collectively provided. Collectively usually means the state, but it could also be in collaboration with other collective organizations. It could be through cooperatives, etc. But usually the state is assumed to have an important role here in the provision. And what sorts of services does that include? Usually it's things like healthcare, education, public transport, and things like that, housing policies as well. And yes, as some of you have already said, especially in the UK, for example, but also in other countries, of course, we already have some elements of these universal services. So, for example, the NHS is a universal basic service. It provides healthcare to everyone, free at the point of use, and based on a needs assessment. So if you are deemed to be in need of a medical treatment, then you will get it. And so some universal basic services could, in theory, also be provided without any needs testing, in my view. So, for example, things like giving people free electricity or free gas for heating their homes, or free internet access. So these could be things that could be given to everyone in society, at least for a basic amount, for free. So in that sense, there is sort of a parallel here maybe to UBI, in the sense that it could be seen as an in-kind income that is also equal for everyone, only for these types of services. And yes, the proposal itself, so the term universal basic services, is probably more recent than universal basic income. In the UK, the proposal for universal basic services has been made by the Institute for Global Prosperity only in 2017, and it is now supported by a range of organizations, including the New Economics Foundation and the New Initiative for the Social Guarantee. And yes, as I said earlier, so universal basic services can be seen to actually focus on the production or the provisioning side of the economy, because they don't give people an income to purchase things, but they directly change how these services are being provided. These services are then, in that case, not being provided by the market or by private organizations, but by the state or other collective organizations. I should say that in relation to home energy or internet, they could still be provided by private actors, but these private actors would be obliged by the state to provide them for free, or at a set minimal price, for example. So it would be much more regulated than the current market provision that we have. Okay, so in which sense then can it be argued that UBI and UBS can support sustainable welfare or a well-being economy more broadly? In the paper, I used the term sustainable welfare, but as I said, I think it's very close actually to the understanding that we have of a well-being economy, because what I mean by that are social policies or welfare states that support the satisfaction of human needs within planetary boundaries, and that also means without economic growth. So the assumption is that we would aim to design social policy systems that can actually function without economic growth. And so in the paper, I define 4 criteria that would make social policies basically sustainable welfare policies. And these 4 criteria are planetary boundary. So these policies would need to have positive environmental outcomes, basically emission reduction, reduction of pollution, conservation of biodiversity, etc., etc. The policies would need to contribute to need satisfaction of everyone. They would also need to promote fair distribution of resources and opportunities. And they would need to be conducive to better democracy and be democratically run themselves. And this is particularly important, I think, for universal basic services. Oh, yes, and I had this nice, I completely forgot, this nice animation here. So that was for the planetary boundaries. This is for the needs. That is for equality. And here we have the 4th one, which is democratic governance. And so now I go briefly through these 4 criteria to explain how each of them can be seen to contribute to these outcomes, but also what certain criticisms might be. And then I briefly summarize the comparison between the 2. And that is basically the talk. So in terms of environmental outcomes then, the main argument that is being made why universal basic income could have positive environmental outcomes is that it could reduce the supply of labor in the economy. And if people work less, then there would inevitably less consumption and therefore also a reduced material throughput to the economy. And that's exactly, what we mean by staying within planetary boundaries. However, the employment effects of universal basic income can be quite varied across different economic groups. So, for example, several universal basic income experiments, some of which are not sort of proper experiments as in, that the basic income was distributed to everyone in society, but sometimes they were more targeted, for example, to people who were unemployed or on other benefits and so on. But basically some of these experiments have shown that actually giving people who are more on the fringes of the labor market or excluded from the labor market, that it can actually increase their labor market participation. And one explanation for that is often that they would keep the universal basic income even if they take up work. And so it's different to benefits which disappear once you take up work and hence are a disincentive sometimes to then take up employment. But the idea is that a UBI could ideally reduce the supply of labor of those who are already working a lot, who probably work overtime and are stressed and so on. And so that for these people, universal basic income would basically provide them with this portion of income that they can now trade in with leisure time, and basically enjoy that free time, and hence reduce their labor market participation. So a counter argument is sometimes that universal basic income could actually increase economic growth because it could make the economy more efficient. This is often an argument that is used by more right-wing policymakers or more right-wing supporters in this debate, because the idea is that universal basic income would replace some other benefits, sometimes even all other sort of cash benefits. And if these other cash benefits are needs tested or means tested, then having a UBI replace them could, basically save money, save time, save resources, and hence make the economy more efficient. And yes, and some, like I said, more conservative supporters then argue that could actually be positive for economic growth. That obviously would not really fit with this criteria of planetary boundaries. However, so another way in which UBI could contribute to environmental positive environmental outcomes is that if UBI makes society more equal, then there could be less what is sometimes called conspicuous consumption. And so this is consumption that people engage in to, for example, signal their social status or to maintain or improve their social status. And so if there's greater equality, the idea is that people wouldn't need, consumption to actually do that. Because everyone is more equal anyway already, and there's less competition. All right, and the argument for universal basic services is, some of these are similar because of the arguments that I just mentioned, because universal basic services can be seen as an in-kind income. And so in that sense, it could also contribute to a reduced supply of labor and also to greater equality. But one additional point for universal basic services is the argument that if the state provides these services, then the state can directly provide them in a green and environmental beneficial way. I will come back to that question because, to my mind, it's not necessarily a given that the state would do that. So I think we need to have means and instruments to take the state into account to account so that they really do that. Okay, so briefly then about need satisfaction. How do the two instruments or policies contribute to need satisfaction? Universal basic income would do this more indirectly because, like I said, it's just an income that people get. But with this income, people can then purchase the goods and services that they need and hence, improve their need satisfaction. Universal basic services would do that more directly because obviously giving people free healthcare, free education, possibly things like free energy, water, internet access, public transport, etc., directly satisfies people's needs. And so this is another argument why universal basic services is sometimes, here in the UK, I should say, presented as superior to universal basic income. For both universal basic income and universal basic services, the idea is that giving people this cash or in-kind income creates more time for people to engage in purposeful activities. So basically activities that mean something to them, that they enjoy, and that can be beneficial for their own well-being, just simply because of the enjoyment factor, but also it can be positive for the well-being of others, because often it's these sorts of activities that currently are under-provided in our economies because of this lack of time. Things like caring for others, looking after other people, interacting with friends and family, but also things like volunteering, participation in democracy as well. And that's not only going once every 4 years to the ballot box, but also engaging with parties, with demonstrations. It could also be organizational democracy. you know, if we had more organizational democracy, that would actually take a lot of time for people to engage in. So again, UBI and UBS could contribute to these things by simply giving people more time to do that. So fair distribution then, I already indicated that it's thought that both UBI and UBS would be able to create a more equal society. And there are two reasons for this. So for UBI, the income itself, even though it's the same amount, that in itself would still have progressive effects in the meaning, in the sense that this income would be worth more in relative terms to low income people compared to rich people. And then in addition, if a UBI is financed with progressive taxes, so for example, through a progressive income tax or with taxes on wealth, like financial wealth or property or land or whatever, then actually the UBI would come out as a net loss for rich households. So basically rich households would pay more to finance it than they get back from the UBI, and poor households would get more back than they pay, if that makes sense. So we would see quite a big redistribution here financially in society. And universal basic services in a way is similar. The difference is that the services are seen as an in-kind income. But there's some interesting research that actually looks at how people currently use all the free services that the state provides, so things like healthcare, education, and so on. And it's thought that actually the take-up of these services is fairly evenly distributed across different income groups. There are differences for different types of services. So as you can imagine, in countries where you have free higher education, for example, that usually benefits more the richer people in society. But at the same time, this is balanced out by greater uptake of the health services and other social services by lower income people. So basically, on average, we can say roughly universal basic services are, benefiting different income groups in relatively even terms. And so again, if universal basic services are financed through progressive taxation, then again, we see this net loss for rich households and net gains for poorer households. Okay, and then finally about democratic governance, and actually I have already said a little bit about this, that the idea is both UBI and UBS would give people more time to engage in political processes and also in organizational democracy. It would also, of course, give people more time for education, as in proper education that you do because you value the knowledge that you gain and so on, not necessarily to increase your career prospects or to contribute to economic growth, but actually because the education itself has a value. And that is really important for the quality of democracy again, because better informed people who are used to discussing, listening to each other and so on, that will create better democratic outcomes. And very fundamentally, another idea is that if we have a society with better social security, then that actually increases people's trust in government and general political trust, and that would again contribute to better democracy. What we see at the moment is exactly the opposite. We have an increase in inequality, people feel much less socially secure, and that is thought to really feed into the increase of populism, of political alienation, and so on. So again, UBI and UBS are really important here to address these problems as well. Okay, so going on then to the question about, is there then a conflict between these two? And yes, and this is probably a discussion that has been particularly relevant here in the UK, and it has been interesting to see how this is reflected in other countries. So hopefully we can discuss about this later a little bit more. So UBS supporters basically criticize universal basic income for being reliant on market provisioning. They say it's great to give people an income, But what if the market actually doesn't deliver? There are many market failures, as we know. Energy companies can, they are crazy monopolies. They can charge us for the energy that they provide us with at prices that they basically more or less decide. And markets might not provide goods and services, other goods and services as well, at the quality and cost that we would expect. Another good example here is the housing market, which is quite often used in this discussion. So, for example, this example of the lone mother who gets a universal basic income, but has to find a flat for her and her child in a very very inflated, overpriced housing market. So in that context, yes, a universal basic income might not actually help her much because simply the price of that flat is so extortionate. So like I said earlier, universal basic income does not actually address how these goods and services are being produced or provided. And actually one consequence of that is also, or relates also to the environmental impact of UBI, in that it cannot be necessarily guaranteed that the goods and services that are on offer in the market have a lower carbon impact, for example. Also, another question related to universal basic income is how it would actually impact on consumption levels. Would it really reduce consumption? Partly here the question mark is that if universal basic income increases consumption by lower income households, that could increase emissions, because the consumption of lower income households is often more carbon intensive per pound, dollar, euro, etc. Yeah, it's not overall more carbon intensive or higher carbon because lower income households consume much less than high income households, but because low income households spend a higher proportion of their income on things like energy for heating their home and for cooking and so on. This is probably the biggest part here, actually. This is also why their consumption is more energy intensive per monetary unit. Whereas if a rich person gains income, they will spend it more likely on whatever, going to the opera or buying a painting or whatever. And so this is sort of, lower carbon per unit. Okay, so universal basic income supporters also highlight that universal basic services would cater more directly for people's need satisfaction, because, like I said earlier, because these goods and services are being directly provided, not indirectly through the market, and that universal basic services could be designed directly in an environmentally friendly way. And so one concern by universal basic services people is that a universal basic income could crowd out universal services. So the fear is that if a lot of financial resources are being spent on universal basic income, then the state would have no capacity anymore to, in addition, also provide universal basic services. And I do think there is a point to that, but I think one can get around that problem to some extent. Okay, so and this is basically my last slide here before the conclusion. So basically what I want to argue is that really what matters is what the policy context and the economic context is within which universal basic income and universal basic services operate, and that we can address these weaknesses of UBI in particular by basically having an appropriate policy context. And what I mean by that is that, yes, we can regulate markets, for example, and it is true that universal basic income usually doesn't directly talk about the way in which markets would need to be regulated, but there's no there's no reason why this could not be actually discussed in conjunction. So, for example, markets could set maximum rents. There could be energy efficiency standards for accommodation, and of course, all the products that are being manufactured. There could be emission caps, economy-wide or internationally. And all these different types of regulations and standards would determine the environmental impacts of our consumption. And so when you then give people a free income, they would automatically buy these, environmentally friendly products. And so the advantage then is actually of UBI, in my view, that UBI provides you with some choice. And I think choice is still quite important for certain areas where, for example, personal preferences and needs are more varied. Then it is actually quite important to be able to say to people, okay, here you have an income, but you can choose what to spend it on. Whereas universal basic services are more suitable for more uniform goods and services or uniform needs. So electricity, water, internet access, it really doesn't matter that much, how these goods and services are being provided. There are obviously differences between different packages and so on, but yeah, you get my argument here. So also, like I said earlier, it's not actually guaranteed, I think, that universal basic services provided by the state are necessarily provided in an environmentally friendly way or in ways that do really address people's needs. This is, I think, an assumption that is a little bit naive sometimes. States, need to be held to account to do these things. We as citizens need to demand these things from them. They don't do this sort of automatically. And therefore, the governance of the collective provisioning of these services is very, very important. The way in which the provisioning is organized, it needs to be organized in a participatory way. It needs to be organized so that users of these services can input directly their wishes and needs. So it needs to be responsive to needs. And yeah, when I say they need to be accountable, I mean there needs to be some mechanism so that we can, for example, have an influence on who is running these services, including their political agendas, of course. So, and then coming on to the argument about the crowding out, I think that could be addressed by making universal basic income a partial universal basic income. So basically to say, yes, we do acknowledge that many services and goods can be provided collectively, and that there may be advantages in doing so because the collective provisioning always has some efficiency gains, etc. They are better for addressing market failures. There's no doubt about it. And so once we take that into account, then obviously the amount that people are being paid through a universal basic income wouldn't need to be that high. Yeah, it could be a partial universal basic income. But I think giving people that partial universal basic income would still be important for all the other reasons that I have earlier discussed. And that is basically the end of the presentation. So just to summarize the key takeaway points, is that I've argued that universal basic income and universal basic services, even though they're presented as conflicting approaches, can actually complement each other, and that both in their own ways can promote a fairer and greener society. And I've also tried to argue that we really need to pay more attention to what is called in quite abstract terms here, institutional context. But by that, I mean the policies that exist in an economy, the way in which we regulate markets, but also the way in which we run public services and collective services. So these kinds of contexts really shape the outcomes, the social and environmental outcomes of universal basic income and universal basic services. And hence we really need to discuss these things together in conjunction. Otherwise, I think we just lose the perspective of how they exactly function. Okay, I stop here, and I'm very, very curious to hear what your thoughts are. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Milena. Thank you. That was fantastic. So this is the time for those who are joining this WEAll talk for the first time. This is the time when if you have any suggestions or any questions for Milena, is just raise your hands or use the bottom of in the bottom menu. And feel free to open your mic and share your thoughts. Colin, I noticed that you wrote down something in the chat. I don't know if you would like to share it with your own voice. Are you still here? Can I say? Oh, yes. Yes, you are.
Yes, I'm still here. I'm sorry. I tried to turn my camera on out of politeness, but something strange has happened. I think it's giving you a picture of my ceiling or something. I can't understand the way it's working. So I apologize for that.
Don't worry.
Yes, my comment really was about the problem with UBS. If it's state supplied services, we know already where we have a limited extent of this in a very marketized economy, such as in the UK, where I am. We either have over or under supply because of the failure of planning. I mean, in the past, we've seen the classic failures of socialist planning in socialist planned economies in Eastern Europe and elsewhere. They either have over provision and waste, or they have normally under provision and rationing. Whereas the pro-market argument, which UBI relies on to a large degree, is saying, yes, well, people will the demand will balance, according to Adam Smith and all that. Well, of course, we know that's not true because most markets actually fail. They've either got natural monopolies or oligopolies and all kinds of non-perfect, non-welfare maximizing effects. But I think that's the big weakness in UBS, that it's potentially, do you want to end up in the queue for a bag of rice? I mean, literally, that's where you could end up if you had a very poor economy. Now, we're generally talking, I assume, about developed economies, like Western Europe and so on. So the institutional context is crucial, I think. Your last point on the last slide, actually. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Yes. Would you like me to respond directly, or do you want to collect some more responses?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, no, absolutely. I think this is basically this debate exactly boils down to the difference between state provision versus market provision. I do, however, think that, there has been quite a lot of movement in relation to state provision and collective provisioning. And, thoughts about, well, in this day and age where we have internet and online services, that actually learning more about people's needs and basically making the provision more focused and responsive to people's needs could be much easier than it was, several decades ago. So yeah, but I completely agree that on the point that, it really hinges, I think, on the political will and willingness of those in power to actually wanting to do that. And that is, I think, the weakness currently in the UBS debate, or those that support UBS over UBI. I don't think it can be taken for granted that policymakers, governments will want to do this. Like you say, the UK is a good example where we have been moving to a more and more privatized system over the last few decades. And yeah, so yeah, that is exactly what UBS tries to address. Of course, they argue, we need to go back to a more collectively organized economy. And they're fantastic books. I don't know, have you come across, for example, this work by the Manchester people on the foundational economy? They have written really fascinating case studies of several sectors, including the banking sector, the food sector, like supermarkets, and transport sector as well, to really sort of highlight the problems here with privatization, internal markets, and so on, and how this is really failing the consumer. So yeah, this is it. Like we kind of need to go to a better balance, I think, between collective provision and market provision. I think both have their place. This is kind of what I guess I'm trying to argue. But yeah.
I don't know if anyone else would like to comment on this specific trend, or if you have any further questions for Milena, because I know that Milena has some questions ready for you as well. Garrett, yeah.
Would it not be easier to work for universal basic services than for a universal basic income? Because to get a universal basic income, politicians will be very reluctant because it is such a massive shift of money and they don't know what to expect. And even if it's a considerable amount, you still do not know whether all the benefits can be removed, because maybe some people still don't have enough in their situation. Whereas with the services, you can do it gradually and without a lot of risk.
Yeah, that is a valid argument, I think. And actually, it really refers to the question that I had prepared in case no one would be raising their hand, because my question would have been, what are the biggest barriers to the introduction of universal basic income and universal basic services? What I find interesting, though, is that in the aftermath of COVID-19, or in the whole context of COVID-19, there seems to have been quite a bit of discussion about universal basic income. And we have seen quite a few experiments with universal basic income. So, that kind of indicates to me that it's not impossible to introduce a universal basic income. But yes, I agree. I mean, it would need, like you said, it would probably need I don't know, I'm just thinking in the back of my mind whether it would be a bigger shift compared to UBS, because changing benefits, yes, is obviously is a difficult task politically, but let's say re-collectivizing the provision of, or the ways in which the energy markets and transport markets and so on currently work, that's also not exactly easy, right? Because there are very big interest groups there who benefit from the current setup. So yeah, I'm a little bit in two minds as to which one is actually harder to implement.
Milena, we have two people waiting, and they raise their hands. One is Amanda and the other one is Roger. So please feel free, Amanda.
Oh, well, first of all, let me apologize. I had another call, so I was only able to join halfway through your presentation, but it's really fascinating. I just had a question, and maybe you covered this. So, but I know that Finland had an experiment with UBI, right? But then they didn't end up implementing it on the basis of that. Do you know why that was? And if because I also with COVID, there's a lot more, as you say, I think discussion around UBI and experiments with it in different sort of ways, but that was one that was really seen as potentially being a pioneer in the space. And then they didn't.
Yeah, absolutely. And you catch me out here, because on my to-do list is read the report and the decision as to why they haven't taken this experiment forward. I'm really sorry, but I would basically not sort of say anything particularly useful right now, I think, because this is something I wanted to follow up and simply haven't got around to it.
No way.
But if there's someone in the audience, I think there was maybe someone from Finland. Yeah, it would be really great to hear.
I can see Anne saying that I'm not sure if that means that or yes, you do. So maybe here we go. Anne, your mic.
Okay, so I know there are people from Finland here, so they may correct me, but the Finnish experiment was always designed to be just a 2-year experiment. And in truth, it wasn't a UBI experiment. Only 2,000 people were selected at random, and they were already unemployed. So it wasn't like giving a basic income to everyone in a household or a community. There were some good results in terms of mental health. People reported decreased levels of stress and some kind of marginal increased participation in the labour market. And that was one of the big terms of reference. But it was pretty inconclusive in the long run, I think. And I think that as far as I know from speaking to Finnish colleagues in the basic income movement, the debate has moved on a little bit from basic income in Finland now. I think it's just been sort of left to one side. There is a lot online about it. I won't say any more and take up any more time, but it's an interesting one to look at.
Thank you.
I also just checked my notes because I think so there was a very recent discussion about another UBI tribe, but I think that was actually in Canada, where, you know, Ian Goff, for example, has commented on this and said, yeah, a UBI trial that was basically ended before it was supposed to finish. So
that was in Ontario. And
yes.
I think a change of government just put an end to that. But people were very annoyed. The participants were very, very put out about that.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm aware of the time. We may be running a few more minutes late, but I think this exchange of information coming from different people, I just love it. This is what WEAll talks are all about. But Roger has been waiting for a little while. So Roger, all yours.
I was just going to say a couple of things, Milena. One is thank you. I think it was an amazing presentation. I came into this really worried about UBS because I heard somebody a couple of weeks ago argue that transport needed to be included in UBS because, quotes, people need to get around. And it struck me as a transport campaigner, you know, that you could justify almost anything on that basis. And real questions about what the limits are and, you know, what people really need to do and how you define basic needs and this sort of stuff. So I think the way you presented it, it's not an either or. It's a horses for courses. I think was excellent. And I just wanted to sort of really ask how Anna and Amanda, maybe how we all can get this message across that it is a question of the two working together, because the real enemy isn't UBS or UBI. The real enemy is unfettered market economies, or even market economies that are structured for the needs of the corporates. And you know, that we've got to make allies with the people who are supporting UBS and try and get over that UBI maybe is part of the picture as well. And I just wondered how we might do that. Sorry if that was a hard question.
Well, my first thought is, okay, I'm going to follow up on this with Milena because I'm positive that she's going to be able to connect us. And because for me, everything starts with making the connections, making sure that we create spaces for conversations to happen, to understanding, to, you know, through questions, through understanding what everybody's doing and how they're doing it. And then, of course, identifying what is it that is not being done and how we could do it in a collaborative way. That is my first thought. So nothing I cannot address like in a specific, but my first thought it was, okay, I'm going to follow up to respond to Roger about this with Milena, because I'm positive that she's going to be able to bring more names and connections on how we could bring them into WEAll and create those spaces for conversations to happen. That is my first thought. I don't know if Amanda wants to add anything, or Milena, please feel free.
No, I mean, the thing I wanted to add, maybe just from the knowledge and policy sort of realm, is that I think what's really important from WEAll's perspective is that we recognize that it's not always like, I think we want like one solution. People want silver bullet solutions. And then we're very trying not to do that, right? To say for any objective we have or vision we have for well-being, there are a wide variety of strategies and solutions and examples and approaches that can be considered within that space. And so it's something where when Milena sent her wonderful paper, I was like, oh, we really need to do one on economic security. Yeah, and thinking about the broad range of different ways in which we ensure economic security, and not having that just be like, okay, this is a paper for UBI, right? For example, like just one being proposed, but really looking at a wide range of different ways, formal and informal also, yeah, that we end up ensuring the security and feeling of security for people that they need in order to flourish.
Thank you, Amanda. Milena.
Yeah. I have to apologize. It is absolutely chucking it down here, and it's also thundering. So if it all sounds a bit funny, then this is because I'm sitting in my attic, and it's absolutely chucking it down. I very much like the idea of saying, there isn't a silver bullet. I would absolutely completely agree with that, because every country, every region is different. We just can't come up with a single thing that fixes it overall. And I think that was one of the intentions with this paper, really to say, and I personally also, I think, stand there to sort of say, yes, we will still need markets to some extent. So markets and capitalism is not the same thing for me. I think capitalism is a particular way in which markets function, which, as we all know, highlights exploitation, etc., and growth, of course. But markets have a much longer history, and I think markets will still need to play some role, even in a well-being economy. But we need to make sure that these markets function in a way that they are able to address people's needs, and that we are able to remain within planetary boundaries. And this is where this idea of the importance of context comes in again. We need to regulate these markets in some ways. We need to make sure that there aren't big monopolies. We need to make sure that there are regulations, environmental regulations, human rights, social regulations, etc., that prevent exploitation and so on. And if markets operate within these boundaries, then I think, they can play an important role. And this is where UBI is then still useful, because it gives people that social security and the choice to actually choose, what is actually being produced in the market. I could go on about what we need to change with markets. It's all about also how we run organizations, businesses, basically. But at the same time, collective provisioning can be really useful, because it can overcome some of these market failures. It can pool risks, it can pool resources. And so this is often what markets don't manage. There's a good reason why health systems and education systems in pretty much like all developed economies and many other economies are publicly provided, or at least a large part of them is publicly provided, because they are collective goods. Yes. And so, that's basically my message. I think we need both collective provisioning and market provisioning, but we do need to make sure that markets are being regulated and that states are being held to account, and that the collective provisioning is being organized in ways that remains responsive to people's needs, so that people don't end up in a long queue standing there for a package of rice. So that would be sort of my wrap-up. Probably sentence to that point.
I was gonna say we're just it's 6 p.m. here in Spain. It's 5 p.m. and many other times in other parts of the world. I always try to be very respectful with time. Colin, I can see your hands raised. That is going to be for you, the last question or the last comment to be shared, and then we're going to wrap up the WEAll talk of this month. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much for that. And you actually get to see me looking normal, or more or less. Finally, just a comment on which you may wish to comment. You talk about social provisioning and accountability in institutions and democratic processes and so on. It raises the question of the level of granularity, holding the state to account. What is the state? Is it the city or the regional government? Or is it the national government? In the UK, we have an interesting process going on with the Scottish government, which has rather limited devolved powers, but wants to be more WEAll oriented, as we know, compared to the Westminster government, which is neoliberal. So what level do you make the provisioning at, and therefore do the planning and the accountability and the market, controlling the market and so on? Then you have the international level, where many corporations are bigger than many countries now.
Fantastic point. Thank you. Yes. And I mean, in my naive mind, I imagine this to be this sort of nice multi-level model where, you know, we need to obviously have a national government and frameworks that set out certain principles and so on. But I think devolving responsibility for the actual delivery on the ground, it would be better to have that in a more decentralized fashion, so that subnational governments, local authorities and so on play a much bigger role in the organization of the public provision. But yes, we do need redistribution, you know, between regions, because there are these massive economic inequalities between regions, and there need to be standards that are set by the national level, because otherwise there is no level playing field. So we need to make sure that the decentralization of responsibility is backed up with mechanisms that avoid the increase of inequalities across regions. But yeah, decentralization is also good, because then of course that is also the level where it's much easier for the users of these services, i.e. citizens. It's much easier for them to actually put in, you know, express their thoughts. That is the level where it can be participatory and co-productive. Yeah, I like this term of co-producing, co-produced public services as well. But that only works at that level. I hope that's at least a brief answer to your question.
I'm positive that we could continue talking about this for another hour. And I want to say thank you for you to stay a little bit longer over the hour. I apologize again for whatever happened with the Zoom link, that it created a little bit of a hassle at the very beginning. Milena, what can I say? Thank you so much for your presentation. Thank you so much for everything that you have shared with us today. Thank you everyone for participating, for making these talks always so inspiring. And we'll see you next month. And you will see the recording of this. You will be able to share with everyone. We will post it on the Slack. We will post it on the WEAll Citizens platform. And thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Milena.
Thank you so much, and everyone. It was really great to participate and to have all your thoughts. Cheers.